There we go. Okay. All right. So, hi and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I am Dr. Jessica Parker. I'm the owner and CEO of Dissertation by Design and the Dissertation Coach. These two companies are very similar in that we offer really comprehensive support to PhD students, EdD students, really all types of graduate students at various stages of the research process. I started Dissertation by Design in 2017. At that time, I was working as a full-time research director. I was writing grants. I was very much living and breathing research, and I needed a break from higher ed to come home and take care of my father. I intended to go back to higher ed, but my consultancy ended up growing. And then I recently acquired the Dissertation Coach after getting to know Allison Miller, who was the founder of the Dissertation Coach, really well. And she decided to retire. And so I'm now running both of those companies. But again, we offer the exact same services. So today I'm talking to you about how to write a lit review. This is a topic that I know very well. I've given some version of this webinar probably at least 50 times over the past 10 years. I do update it every time to reflect sort of new perspectives that I have, new technologies that are out, including AI. So we'll touch on some AI tools today. But this is a high level overview. We're not going to go into a ton of specifics because, as I'm sure many of you are aware, writing a literature review is extremely complex. I could have a separate webinar on every topic we're going to talk about today. So for those of you who are joining, or if you haven't done this yet, if you could drop your name in the chat and where you're joining from. And then I'd love for you to just share with each other, like, what is one word that comes to mind when you think about writing your lit review? I know for me, when I was a doctoral student, the word was overwhelmed. I still feel overwhelmed when I'm writing a lit review. I still conduct research. I'm working on a literature review right now for a publication, and it's still challenging for me. I don't know that it necessarily gets easier. Just maybe am more confident than I was the first time I wrote a lit review. So feel free to drop in that one word that comes to mind when you think about writing a lit review. We have a lot on our agenda today. This is an overview of everything that we're going to discuss. We're going to start by talking about the importance of choosing a topic and defining your questions as a starting point for the lit review, and then searching for literature, selecting and evaluating sources, analyzing and synthesizing information, outlining and writing. The only thing we're not going to get to today is revision and editing, but that is a very important part of this process, so I didn't want to leave it out. And even though I present this as like a linear process, I think if any of you have written a lit review before, if you're in the middle of it right now, you definitely recognize that this is not a linear process. So I'm going to talk about it in a linear way, but there's going to be times where maybe you're working on your outline and you're going to go back to searching the literature. You'll get feedback from your chair, a peer, a supervisor, and you might go back to the process of selecting and evaluating sources. So this is very much an iterative and evolving process, but I am going to present it in a linear way because that's just what we have to do when we're giving a presentation. I want to start out by just stating what, for many of you, might be obvious, but what is a literature review? I want to just define it for you, and I want to highlight the importance of this idea of critical analysis. It is a critical analysis of the literature on a specific topic, that's your research topic, and it's your discussion of that critical analysis. And so having that critical eye, engaging in critical reading, which I'll talk about, is such an important part of this. It's not just reading and writing. All of this is a critical evaluation of the literature on your topic, and you're demonstrating your knowledge of the topic through the writing. And so don't forget that critical analysis component. And then when we think about like what is the role of the literature review in a research study, Again, for some of you, this might be obvious, but I like to point this out. This is something that I tell my doc students. So you're engaging in scholarly discourse. For many of you, you might be just now becoming immersed within your field of study and your discipline from an academic perspective. You're demonstrating that you're becoming an expert on this topic because you are through conducting a lit review and conducting your research. The goal is for you to become an expert. And that's how you're demonstrating that expertise is through conducting a lit review and writing the lit review. You're demonstrating a need for your study, so it is inherently argumentative. Even if you don't think of it as an argument, you are, at the end of the day, making an argument that your study is needed. And you're identifying research gaps through looking at the evidence that is available, thinking critically, and you're going to point out probably multiple gaps in the literature, even though you might not be addressing all of those gaps with your study, but that's also part of this process. So let's just dive into like, how do you start? That's a question that I get really frequently, is like, what is a good starting point? And the very first starting point is making sure that you have a very clearly defined topic. Now, very often when I talk to a graduate student or even an early career scholar, typically they come to me and they talk about their interest. They're like, oh, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm interested in studying. And they talk about their interest, but they really struggle to transition from this like broad interest to a very specific problem. And that's typically the first area where people struggle, is because they'll go in and try to conduct a literature search based on that broad interest, and they become extremely overwhelmed by the number of articles that are available. And so I often start by having a conversation to really understand how we can transition this broad interest to a very narrow and specific problem as a starting point. Because inevitably what's going to happen is that research problem is going to evolve. It's going to shift as you learn and read literature and critically analyze it. But you do have to start somewhere. And starting with a broad problem where you have hundreds of thousands or even tens of thousands of search results is a very overwhelming place to start. So I want to highlight ways that you can transition from a broad interest to a specific problem. So let's just imagine that you are interested in student success in higher education. I've had multiple conversations with students about this over the years, where they kind of frame it as, yeah, I just wonder like why some students are more successful than others when seemingly they come to the table with like the same resources, the same support systems. And so that's a really broad question, this idea of student success in higher ed. And so if that's your interest and you're going into the literature using that as your search starting point, which is what I did. I just wanted to see how many search results there were. And there were 33,000 just using those keywords around student success in higher ed. That is very overwhelming. Like, you're not going to read 33,000 articles or even search through 33,000 articles. So that's kind of your first hint that you're not thinking specific enough, that it's not focused. But how do we get there? How do we get to that focused? So I like to talk to folks first about the scale. Like, are you looking at this problem through the lens of like it being a micro level problem where you're focused on an individual or a small group? Is it meso level? Are you thinking at the organization or community level? Or is this a macro level issue where you're aiming to develop a theory or look at a global perspective or a societal perspective on an issue? And so that's a really good starting point to ask yourself, like, what is that level of focus? And then you can start to think about, if you are doing human subject research, what are those subject specific factors that you're interested in? Maybe you think about it in terms of time. There is a specific historical period or time frame that can help you narrow your focus. Maybe there's a geographic location, region, or setting. Maybe it's a specific demographic of a very large target population, in this case, a student. Maybe there's a specific aspect of the context, an environment, or a condition. So these are different ways to think about subject-specific factors that can help you narrow from, in this case, just the idea of a student and their success to a much more specific problem. And then there's this idea of knowledge gaps. And a lot of times you can't get to the knowledge gap until you've done the lit review. But I would imagine that before you get to the independent stage of your research where you're writing your proposal, that you've already done some sort of a literature search on your topic. So you may be able to come to the table with some idea of at least what one gap in the literature is. So let's take a look at what this looks like from this broad focus of an interest to a problem using this example of student success in higher ed. So let's imagine that the student who came, the doctoral student who came to the table, who's interested in looking at student success in higher ed, starts to reflect and think about it through this funnel that I talked about. So they immediately are like, I want this to be individual level. I really want to look at the individual student. And then through the reflection on these subject-specific factors, they identify that they're really looking at the US four-year institutions. And they're really interested in first-generation students because perhaps this graduate student is a first-gen student. And then they start to think about the context. And maybe initially they land on first-year seminar programs. So as you can see, this is a much more specific research problem that is going to allow this researcher, this scholar, to go into the literature and find a much more manageable number of search results to get started. Now, does this mean that this is ultimately the problem they're going to investigate? No. I always get this question. It's like a chicken or the egg issue. Like, you have to read the literature to know what exactly your topic will be, but you have to know what your topic will be to go into the literature. And so I see this as like extremely iterative. You might realize that like we already have the answer to this. We already know the impact of these first-year seminar programs. But maybe there's some aspect of that literature that is still unknown. Maybe you then look at it through a methodological gap. So you're asking the same question, but you're introducing a different method. So there's always a different angle that you can take. But the first step is just making sure that you're asking a question that is manageable enough in order to actually pull the literature together and make some decisions. So I think that this is a great way to go from a broad interest to a specific problem. And that is the very first step of writing a lit review. So now that we've talked about that, let's get to the part where we discuss searching for literature. And this is where I spent most of my time updating the presentation because now we have these AI research assistants that are available and they're not all created equal. So I'm going to talk about those in a moment. But the actual idea of a search strategy is not different. I mean, this is a chart that I've been using to teach the search strategy process for years. You still need to identify your main concepts. So you're thinking about synonyms, keywords, spelling, abbreviations. You still have to think about selecting resources to search. So what are the relevant journal databases? Is there gray literature that you might need to include? How are you searching? Are you going, like, what are the Boolean operators, the quotation marks, the truncation? We think about wildcards. All of those are part of those search strings you're going to develop. And then how are you going to review and refine your results? So this idea of inclusion and exclusion criteria. How are you going to make decisions about what article to include or what not to include? And I like this graphic because it shows that comprehensive process, but you also need to document it. You need to be able to keep track of the decisions you're making. Depending on the type of program you're in, you might be required to really thoroughly document all of these decisions, or you might not. I think regardless of whether or not it's required, I think it's helpful because I can guarantee you that you're not just going to be knocking this out in a weekend. It's going to take time, and it's nice to be able to go back and remember what in the world you were thinking 2 weeks ago, because you are probably not going to remember. And so just get in the habit of documenting a lot of this process, especially your search strategy. A big part of my search process has always been locating a seminal article. And LitMaps is a great resource. They call it a seed paper. LitMaps is an AI research assistant that aids in literature discovery. I love LitMaps because I'm a visual learner. And their whole value proposition is that they help you find that seed paper where a lot of other research emerges. That's like their whole proposition. And that's how they differ from a lot of these AI research assistants like Cite, Elicit, Consensus, SciSpace, Research Rabbit. Those are all wonderful, but LitMaps is a little different. And if you're a visual learner, I think you'll really like LitMaps. I'm going to show you how to read a LitMap. So when you go into LitMaps, and you can try it for free, a lot of these tools, and I'm not getting paid by LitMaps, I just really like them because I'm a visual learner. You go into LitMaps, you don't have to use search strings like you typically would with a library database or Google Scholar. And that's because AI uses semantic search instead of keyword search. So all of these AI research assistants are leveraging a large language model like ChatGPT or Claude or whatever it may be on the back end to conduct a semantic search, which means instead of just scanning like the title and the abstract and the keywords, it's scanning the entire article. So you're often going to get more search results than you would with the typical keyword search process. But with LitMaps, what it does is it gives you results based on information you give it. You could put in your research question or just what I did a few minutes ago, where I had that just sentence that describes the research problem. You could drop that in, and ultimately you get this. You'll get on the left-hand side, you'll get the individual citations with like a summary of that article. But on the right, this is where you have your LitMap. You have your seed article at the top, and then it shows you with lines all of the articles that stem from that, those citations. And the way you read it on this axis is the articles that are further along to the right, that tells you how current they are. And then at the top, how well cited. So I don't have all the bubbles here because it can get overwhelming. I wanted to make this simple to look at. So if you see something here, like this graphic in the middle, this bubble in the middle, that tells you it's not as well cited as something at the very top. And so I find this visually really helpful. And before LitMaps, I always focused, I didn't call it a seed paper. I think of it as like seminal literature where other research has cited it significantly. So it's a very influential piece of literature in your field. I always looked for seminal literature to see who has cited it, and that would help me find relevant sources. And LitMaps, I think, just helps with that a bit more. And so now that we have AI, the literature discovery process is a little different. I have this triangle here because I like to think of it as like triangulating your sources. So we have our traditional academic databases where you go into your library database, you're searching for literature. That's always been there. We have Google Scholar, which I love. And now we have these AI assistants. I just have a few on the side here. There are more popping up every day. LitMaps is one I just showed you. Perplexity has an academic focus. There's Elicit, Cite, Consensus. I'm going to show you an example of Consensus in a moment. A lot of them do the same things, but they all have limitations that I'm going to describe in a moment in terms of the corpus, like the backend database powering these AI assistants. But these tools can be really helpful. It's not cheating to use these research assistants to help you find literature. That's not the same thing as going into ChatGPT and telling it to write your lit review. This is a very different thing that I'm talking about. It's very helpful. I always end up finding additional articles when I use these AI assistants that I missed during my traditional search process. So what is the sweet spot? I get this question almost with every scholar I work with who is conducting a lit review. They're like, when do I know I'm done? Like, when do I know I've pulled enough articles? And there's no rule of thumb. It's not like, oh, you need to find 100. There's no specific number because it's highly dependent upon what your question is and the field of study. But my response is when you can reasonably read and evaluate all of the relevant literature. And then once you are doing that reading, you'll notice a saturation point where you start seeing repeated information and you're not getting any significant new insights. So thinking back to that broader interest and more specific problem, like if my search results, I'm getting 3,100 results in Google Scholar, not all of those are in English. Some of those are going to be duplicate. Not all of those are going to be exactly relevant. So it does take time to whittle it down, but you want to be able to say confidently to your committee that you've looked at all the relevant literature, that you've wrapped your arms around it, you've made sense of it, and you've included it in your lit review. And that's how you know you've hit that sweet spot. And so if you're continuing to search, it could be your search strategy. So I think if you're frustrated and you feel like you have a narrow topic, go meet with your librarian. They can help you with that search strategy. There could be an issue with how you're searching, but if you're searching correctly, it could be that your topic is far too broad and you need to narrow your focus. So we talked about searching for literature. Let's now imagine that you have a lot of literature and you're selecting and you're evaluating those sources and trying to decide whether and how you're going to use them in your lit review. Now, I want to take a moment and just pause and make a point that when I work on these stages, I know I talked about how this is very iterative. It's not a linear process. I do try to segment my time so that I'm not doing multiple things in this list at once, because you're using different parts of your brain during these tasks. So when I sit down and work on my lit review, I'm not searching, analyzing, writing, outlining all in the same session. I try to have a really focused session and only do one of these types of tasks, because otherwise you end up multitasking and you're not going to do anything well. So I think of like searching as a different task than selecting and evaluating. So today I might go and really perfect my search strategy and find 500 articles, probably not that many, but download them. And then tomorrow I'm going to actually start looking at them and determining whether or not I'm going to keep them or trash them, and whether I'm going to take the time to read them. And so I do tend to segment out my time. And I think that that is a helpful strategy so that you don't suddenly find yourself going down rabbit holes and then coming out of a session feeling very unproductive. So now that we've talked about the search, what does it mean to actually select the appropriate literature and evaluate it? One is keeping your research problem, or if you already know what your research question is, great, keep it in focus. I often will put it on a sticky note on my computer. That helps me prevent myself from going down a rabbit hole. I think we maybe can all identify with this. There's been times where suddenly I'm 3 hours in and I'm reading a study and I'm like, this is really interesting, but this has nothing to do with my topic. And so I like to have a sticky note where I have my research problem or research question right there on my desktop, because it does help me stay focused and on task. And so if you're looking at a long list of search results, start with the title. That's the first thing that's going to come up anyway. Does the title contain any keywords related to your research problem and research question? Are there synonyms that are closely related to those key terms? What about the publication date? Is the study current enough? What about the population or the outcome or the context? So think about those specific aspects of your study, and that is a great place to start. Now, there might be other literature that's relevant that doesn't meet these criteria, but as a starting point, go for what is closest to your topic. Zoom in as much as you can, almost as if you're trying to find your exact study, and start there. And then you can start zooming out. So I took that topic, that problem that we narrowed down, and I put it in Google Scholar. I just want to point out a few things to you, for those of you who might not be familiar with Google Scholar, to show you how I would apply what I just talked about. So filtering by publication date, that's an important part of this. First thing I want to point out is Google Scholar bolds the search terms. So based on the search terms that I put in the search bar, I can immediately see which of these are relevant. And if I'm looking through this list, this was 3,130 results. If I'm just starting to scroll through this list to kind of get a sense of what's here, I'm immediately going to prioritize which of these titles has all of my search terms in it. like my intervention, my study population, the outcome. And so if there's a title that contains all of my search terms, first year seminar, first generation, college, and retention, that's going to be a starting point for me. I'm also thinking about how many times a study has been cited. That's why I like LitMaps, because you can look at that axis. So oftentimes, like if I feel like I hit the jackpot and I find, like, look at this study here in the middle, studying the impact of first year seminar completion on first generation academic success. That feels like my exact study using this topic that I'm using for this example today. And I see that it's cited by one and it was published in 2016. So I'm immediately going to go there and look at who has cited it and use that as a starting point for starting to filter through these results. And I didn't filter this by a date range. So this included like everything. You could immediately start narrowing it down. I think if I had clicked, since 2020, there wouldn't be 3,000 results. And then set up Google Scholar alerts. I actively do this. To do this, when you go into Google Scholar, they have their like little 3-line menu. You'll click on that. You'll click alerts. You'll add your search strings. You can even check a box that says include less relevant results, and you'll create that alert by adding your email. I recommend having this on throughout the entire process of conducting your research, so you're just in the know whenever something comes out on your topic. This is something that I still actively do as a researcher. So now let's talk about like an AI research assistant. So not Google Scholar. Consensus is one of many that are out there. A lot of them do have free trials, and I just randomly chose Consensus for this presentation. A lot of these AI research assistants have similar features, so I'm just going to point out a few of them, and then I'm going to help you identify a major limitation of these so that you know that you're using the right tools. So in Consensus, if you go put in a research question or your research topic, which I did here, you're immediately at the top going to get a summary. It's going to summarize, and it says it here, 10 papers. And it's going to attempt to answer the question to help you know whether or not, in this case, like what is the impact of first-year seminar programs on retention rates? So it gives you that. And then it gives you a list of the studies that it used to make that summary. And in that list, you can immediately see the study design, which I really like. That's another way you can think about choosing what articles to focus on first, like choosing really high quality study designs like a meta-analysis, a meta-synthesis, a systematic review, a randomized control trial if you're conducting empirical research. You can immediately see it'll categorize it in terms of like highly cited. You can then click on that study and have like a conversation with it where you ask questions and it almost behaves like a chatbot. And this is a wonderful tool that you can use. I emphasize that my doc students use these tools. I think they're really helpful, but they do have limitations. And I'll just go ahead and point out one, like sometimes this summary is not correct. So you cannot just take that as the truth. You have to use your critical thinking skills. But I think it can be helpful, like especially if you've already come to that conclusion and you're noticing a similar conclusion in other recent studies, and then this validates that, then great, allow it to validate that idea. But don't let that summary be what determines how you're going to answer this questions. And definitely do not copy that summary and paste it into your lit review. So what might be missing here? I'm just going to go ahead and tell you what might be missing for the sake of time. Where is it pulling this information from? Like what databases is it pulling these articles from? Most of these AI research assistants predominantly rely on Semantic Scholar, which is an open access database. This is a breakdown of the fields of study of the articles that are included in Semantic Scholar. And what you'll immediately notice, and this is in the millions, so they have over 200 million research papers in Semantic Scholar. 60 million are uncategorized, so we don't know what field of study. And then a majority of them, medicine, biology, physics, This is medicine and hard sciences. So if you're in the humanities, this type of tool is not going to help you that much. What's really challenging is a lot of these AI research assistants, they don't advertise this up front. So if you're not paying attention to the databases being used, you might inadvertently find yourself coming to a conclusion that there isn't literature on your topic if you're not triangulating, like I suggested, going to Google Scholar, using the typical academic databases. But it might not be true. It might be a gap in the corpus. A corpus is just a database. It might be just a gap in Semantic Scholars corpus, not actually a gap in the literature. And then the fact that these are open access, not behind a paywall, that opens up a whole other host of limitations. So it's really important for you to understand the tools that you're using and what the limitations are before you use them, because there's a lot of AI tools coming onto the market right now, and they're all working really hard to get market share. And I don't think that their marketing is always 100% transparent. So please just keep that in mind. Oh, it went to, clicked on that. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So that was selecting and evaluating whether the sources that you're getting in your search results are relevant. Now let's imagine that you've handpicked multiple articles, and now you have the task of like reading them and analyzing and then synthesizing what you're learning through reviewing the literature. And this, I think, is the most difficult part. So first, I want to define what synthesis is. Synthesis is the process of integrating ideas from various sources to create a new understanding or perspective. So it's your take on what you are reading across multiple sources. It starts with critical reading. There's that analysis component, and then you get to synthesis. So reading two studies and then having a sentence that summarizes those two studies, that is not synthesis. Reading 50 studies and then making multiple claims that reflect your perspective and your understanding of what those studies say about a specific topic, that's how you get to synthesis. And it's really, really challenging. I'm going to talk about why and how to address some of those challenges. And a lot of it stems from, if you're a novice researcher, you don't yet feel like you have a voice. So we sometimes call this like negative authorial identity, where you're kind of like, well, who am I to say that there's a gap? Like, I don't know. I'm not an expert yet. Am I missing something? That is a big challenge in this, is not really having your voice yet as a scholar, because you're not an expert yet, but yet you're still expected to make some claims and synthesize and develop your voice. And it is really hard. So let's start by just touching on like the really important connection between critical reading and writing. Reading research articles with a critical eye is really important. You need to be able to do this in order to effectively paraphrase, to make claims about what you're learning based on the perspective you're taking for your research topic. It's a precursor to synthesizing, and it's a bidirectional relationship. So having a well-written lit review inherently requires you to read critically, and that involves learning how to paraphrase, put other people's ideas into your own words, making claims about what you're learning, and then pulling it all together to present this new perspective. And so when we read critically, it takes time because we have to actually interact with the ideas. We're moving beyond just summarizing, and we have to truly comprehend. And this comprehension is necessary because we are supposed to be questioning what we're reading. Just because it's a published article doesn't mean it's high quality and we should take all of the findings at face value. There's always limitations and biases and assumptions inherent in a published study. We're also working to connect ideas, and we're critiquing. Part of this analysis is a critique. And so this is like active reading, it's time consuming, and it requires stamina. And this is precisely one of the big reasons why writing a lit review takes so much time, and it's really, really challenging. And this is not something you suddenly just get really fast at. Like I have had, I don't know, 17 publications now. I've written textbook chapters, I've written grants. Like, I still take a long time to really read a source and comprehend it and think about what it means in light of all the other literature I have on that topic. It's not ever supposed to be really fast. There's no magic pill to this critical reading process. And that's precisely why I think it's so painful. People are like, how can I speed this up? I'm like, you really can't. It just is what it is. It's the process. And so in terms of getting from critical reading to synthesis, it's all about like responding to the text and resisting an oversimplification or a binary response. So when you're reading a research article, it's not a matter of like, yes, I accept these findings or I reject it. It's a lot more complex than that. A lot of times it might be like, okay, these findings are really relevant, but I think we need to recognize that this population wasn't representative. So what questions does that leave for us? But the findings do align with other findings. So I think that we can accept them to be true, but there seems to be some issues with the representative of the sample across these different studies. So it's not a binary response. And oftentimes when you're reading, we can have like an emotional, quick, or shallow reaction. So resisting that urge to immediately make a decision about the quality of a study or what the limitations are. And really thinking about the intention of the authors and making sure that you're interpreting that intention correctly. I just got, this is a whole other topic, but I find it fascinating. So I'm on ResearchGate and I get notifications whenever my literature is cited. And there's an article that I published earlier this year that's been cited many, many times. It's by far my most successful publication. And I don't normally go in and like read every article that has cited my study, but I just happened to log in and I clicked on the most recent alert that was like, here's a study that just cited your study. I pulled it up and they had cited my study incorrectly. They were making a claim that it implied I had human subjects in my study and that I did an intervention. And I didn't. I analyzed a corpus. There were no human subjects in my study. Now, did they do that intentionally? No. But if you're not paying attention, if you're not slowing down and really thinking about the study and the claims that you're making, that's how that happens. And it is really common. The folks who cited my study incorrectly are not the only ones who have done this. I'm sure I have probably cited someone incorrectly. But that's the risk that you're taking if you're rushing and you're not really thinking about what you're trying to say and understanding the methods and the interpretation of the findings or whatever it may be, whatever you're focusing on within your field of study. So this is really important. I can't really emphasize this enough. So now let's talk about creating an outline. So if you can just imagine you've analyzed a lot of studies, you've made some notes to get to this point of synthesis to prepare for writing, and now you're ready to create an outline to guide the writing process. And please, please, please create an outline. It's so important. You will thank your future self will thank you because it's going to help make sure that writing is organized and that you're really intentional about how you're bringing in all of that information you've just taken in. So when we think about creating an outline, there's a lot of different ways you could approach this. There are multiple different types of like structures of literature reviews. There's topical, so grouping the literature together based on main issues that you noticed within the literature. There's chronological. You might decide that for the argument you're making, you're going to organize the literature based on when it was published. Methodological, maybe you're making a claim about a methodological gap or about issues in the quality of the literature available. There's theoretical, problem, cause, solution is actually my favorite. I tend to use that. General to specific, specific to general. So lots of different outline structures available. And in terms of like, how do you know? You just have to choose it. It just has to make sense to you. But I'm just going to go over some of the four most common ones, and then I'll share a link with you once I send out the recording so that you can look at examples of these types of outlines. So thematic or topical, I'd say, is the most common, where you're organizing the literature around key themes that you're seeing. It's really helpful for identifying gaps in knowledge, but it does require you, before you develop that outline, to have already done that really critical analysis so that you feel confident that you are accurately identifying what those themes are. Theoretical is a really popular one depending on your field of study. So this seems more obvious, but you're just really bringing together the different theories in your research area. So you might have, maybe there's 2 theories that you're building on. And so you have 3 strands of literature where you're introducing those 2 theories, and then you're introducing how you're sort of creating your own conceptual framework, bringing those theories together. So you're really organizing by theory. There's methodological, where you're looking at all the different research methods used, you're comparing and contrasting the different approaches. And you might have several of these. So like my dissertation, the literature review in my dissertation, the first strand of literature was chronological, where I gave like this historical overview of the topic and different policies. And then I transitioned to a more thematic structure after that initial historical overview. And then within one of those themes, I pointed out a methodological gap. And so I don't want to make this overly complex, but it can be a little bit more complex than just one overall structure. It doesn't have to be, but I guess the point I'm making is that there isn't a single right way to do it. I think it's important to have that intention and that clarity up front, and to be able to just defend it and justify it. If your chair is like, I can't figure out how you organize this, and you're like, well, I'm trying to do this like chronological historical overview. And then they may say, oh, okay, let's see. I think you need to restructure this now that I know that that's what you're trying to accomplish. In chronological, that's pretty obvious. Like you're talking about the development of something over time. Maybe you're talking about how policies have evolved, or how a specific intervention or approach has evolved. That's also a really popular way to approach, especially the initial component of a lit review, where maybe you have to give a lot of like historical context about a topic. And so, like I said a moment ago, like, how do you know? There's no right or wrong way. It just needs to make sense to you. It needs to work for you. And importantly, you need to think about it up front before you go in and have pages and pages of writing that now you suddenly have to organize, because that's when it feels like impossible to take a 40-page lit review and now suddenly restructure it. So do yourself a favor and create an outline. I'll share this link with you. This is a blog post that I wrote a while ago. And I have examples of these different types of lit reviews that you could download and see, like, what does a theoretical lit review look like? What does a methodological lit review look like? So you can check that out and look at actual publications that are organized in that way. All right, now to the part of writing. It's kind of funny that you think about writing a lit review and the very last thing I get to is writing, but it really just shows like the complexity of this process. And when I think about writing, I like to remind everyone that ultimately there's several things that you need to have in the back of your mind. You have yourself, the writer, where you bring your own perspective to the table. You could have 2 different researchers looking at the exact same problem, reading the exact same research articles, and have different lit reviews. Now, why would that be? Well, because they have different life experiences that they're bringing to the table that's informing their perspective. So their argument might be very different because they're noticing different things. And so they're bringing the writing together in a different way. And ultimately, that comes down to stance. And whenever you take a stance, you make a claim, you're doing that thinking about the audience. So who is reading this? Not just your professor or your committee, but like ultimately, who is the audience you are writing to? Is it policymakers? Is it educators? Is it clinicians? So that informs the stance you're going to make. And then you think about the text itself, like the actual language you're using, the choices you're making around hedges and boosters and transition sentences and signal phrases. All of those like academic writing nuances are ways that you can demonstrate that stance and communicate it to the audience. So let's dive into this a little bit more. So voice and stance, we use this interchangeably, but this is often the most challenging part because you don't see yourself as an expert yet. Your identity isn't as an expert in your field. And so you might not feel that you have a voice. So oftentimes what we notice with novice researchers is that there's a lot of neutral language in their writing, or there's a lack of argument. It's almost like a textbook where it's just like regurgitating everything that you've learned without actually saying anything about it. And you need to get comfortable developing your voice, because that's ultimately how you're going to develop your credibility and your expertise within your field of study. And so voice and stance are one and the same within this context. I already talked about what stance is, but it's like you're making an evaluation of the subject matter. It's an expression of your perspective that can come through as an attitude, as an assessment. There's a critical evaluation built in here. And it doesn't mean that it's an opinion. This is different. Opinion isn't supported by evidence. A lit review has evidence in it. And so this is not the same as opinion, because you're going to back it up with evidence. That's the difference between just making a claim and just voicing an opinion. And then you're thinking about alternative views. So you're not just making a claim and then leaving out every potential criticism or counter argument. You're considering other perspectives. And when we think about what that looks like in the writing itself, this is more from a linguistic perspective, but I'll say right here, the Academic Phrase Bank is an incredible resource if you're struggling with these components of academic writing. I use the phrase bank all of the time. When we think about developing our stance, there's very specific types of linguistic devices that we can use to accomplish that, like hedges, boosters, counters, so signaling contrast, reformulating. So a hedge would be, softening your claim using words like may or likely or possibly. Boosters is when you're very confident. Certainly, very, must. I always joke, like if you do use AI at all, you'll notice that it uses a lot of boosters. It's really confident. And so that's a lot of times how I can tell that my students are using it, because most students write in a very neutral way, and suddenly I see writing that's very confident and there's a lot of boosters. So I just encourage you to check out this resource if you want to learn more about some very specific like writing formulas and templates that you can use to communicate a point that you'd like to make. I want you to just take a moment and read this while I take a sip of tea. I went ahead and bolded some of the aspects of the writing that I want to stand out to you. On the left side, under published purpose statements, these are purpose statements that were taken out of published research articles. And I have them side by side, student purpose statements, so you can see what I mean in terms of a difference in stance. The student purpose statements are much more neutral. They just say the article is examined in terms of, it's just relaying information. Whereas a more experienced scholar feels more confident because they've developed that expertise, and they're using language that really communicates a very strong, more confident perspective. And that's how that stance comes through. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend more time on this. I will send out this presentation, but just start noticing these aspects of writing when you're reading different articles. Like, just kind of step back. Like, if something really resonates with you and you're like, oh, they got that point across really well. I really like how they relayed that message. Start really looking at the language they're using, because that's how we learn. We can emulate that language in our own writing, and learn how to do that. And this aspect of taking a stance inherently requires you to make claims about what you're learning. And a claim is just a simple declarative proposal that you're making. It's usually a sentence or two. And when we're writing a lit review, we support these claims with evidence. And You get to the point of making a claim by reading the literature and you're drawing inferences from what you're learning. We make claims in many aspects of our lives. This is my cat, Piper, who always jumps in my bag whenever I try to travel. So a claim I might make in everyday life is like, cats are solitary animals. That's a simple claim. Or a more complex claim might be that despite their reputation for independence, cats are actually highly social animals that benefit from regular interaction with humans and other animals. And so there's a simple claim, there's a complex claim. When you're writing your lit review, you're going to make simple and complex claims. You're already doing it, whether you realize it or not. But complex claims inherently require some level of like argumentation and reasoning to help the reader connect the dots. Both require evidence. So you have to, this is how this differs from an opinion. Like could be interpreted as an opinion, but in an academic focus, it's very much a claim because you're going to back it up with evidence. And I'll show you examples. And this is where the academic phrase bank can come in handy. Like if you're not sure, because there's so many types of claims you can make, as you can see here, you might make a claim that there's a research problem, that a study is well designed, a certain methodology is needed, that certain results were present, that there's certain implications, and maybe you don't know exactly how to get that point across. That academic phrase bank has really great sentence formulas that can help you do that. But as researchers, there are a lot of things that we can claim, and you're going to have claims all over your lit review. And the way you back up that claim might look different. Like you might have, this is the exact same information, it's just flip-flopped. You might have a claim and then immediately follow that with evidence. I have the claim in blue, the evidence in red. You don't need to read it to understand that. Or you might have it differently. You might have the evidence first and then the claim second. The point I'm making is they go together. So this is how it's, again, different from opinion because you're setting forth that claim and then you're backing it up with evidence. Here's a longer example where I have a claim bold, and then I have evidence right here in the middle of the paragraph. In blue, you can see how I'm putting forth my stance using very specific types of devices. And then there's a call to action. And again, you don't need to read this right now, the whole paragraph. I just want to point out these very specific components of academic writing so that hopefully you can start paying attention to this when you're reading, and it'll give you ideas for how you can similarly communicate your ideas to your audience in your lit review. And going back to this idea of like organizing your outline before you write, this is something that I still do, where I might have the outline for my lit review. And as a starting point, instead of just writing in paragraphs, I have bullet points with the different pieces of evidence I'm going to use within that paragraph or that section of literature. And then that'll give me a starting point to go in and start writing and adding transition sentences and that connective tissue to pull it together. And the reason I like to do this is like no one likes to look at a blank page. So even just an outline can be intimidating to get started. So this gives me something immediately to jump in and start doing. And then visually, I can start to look at the outline and I see all of my bullet points and I can start to see issues where I'm missing sources for a specific component of the lit review. And so it helps me visually as well. And so this is just a tip for organizing evidence under your claims when you're starting to write. Another great approach for writing when you think about developing your voice is thinking about a top-down writing approach. Many of us tend to go from the bottom up. And what that means is we're looking at specific pieces of literature, we're looking at that evidence, and then we're organizing it and we're arranging it, and then we think of what the argument is. And sometimes that's necessary. Like if you really are brand new to your field of study and you do not have a good grasp on the literature, then yes, you probably do have to start with this bottom-up approach. But typically by the time you get to the candidacy stage where you're independently developing your proposal, you've already read some literature on your topic, and I would be willing to bet that you already have some sort of argument building in your brain, even if you don't feel confident about it. So a top-down approach is where you already have that argument present, and that higher level argument, you can just write it down. Like I think about that research problem I had earlier, that would be like a higher level argument. And then you can start to organize and examine the evidence from that perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that you ignore evidence that doesn't align with that argument. But when you do follow that top-down approach, it just psychologically makes you approach the literature in a slightly different way that can help you develop your voice. And there's literature behind this. This isn't something I made up. And then following writing structures. I'm now going to just show you the meal plan, and then I'm going to conclude. This is something that most people love. It's a very specific writing structure for structuring your paragraphs. It helps with paragraph unity and cohesion. And it's where the paragraphs, not all of them, but many of them in your lit review need to have like a topic sentence, so a main idea, evidence to support that main idea, your analysis of the evidence, which I find is often missing with novice researchers. I tend to just get information overload. And then link or lead. So that's like your transition sentence to the next paragraph, or depending on where that paragraph is situated, like linking back to your argument or your topic. And so here's an example of what this looks like in paragraph form. So we have the main idea is this first sentence. This is also, you could think of this as your claim. And then immediately after this, we have the evidence to support that claim. And then look at all of this analysis. This is where I talked about like the critical reading is so important. And this is often what is missing in a graduate student's lit review is I don't see this analysis. I'll just see like a claim and then all this like information overload data being thrown at me, and I don't get their take on it. You know, I want to know like, why did you include this? What is your take on this evidence? And then we have our transition to like the next paragraph to help with that cohesion and that flow. And when you think about writing a meal plan paragraph, oftentimes I don't write the transition sentences. My first like really rough draft will be the claim, the evidence, the analysis, and then I'll put a placeholder, because a lot of times I'll just chop up the writing. I'll end up moving entire paragraphs around. So I don't put that polishing touch transition sentence until I know that that paragraph is going to live there. Ooh, it's already 1 o'clock. I included so much information in this when I added the AI research assistants, but I've already touched on this idea of negative authorial identity. My hope is that a lot of these tips can help you really overcome maybe any of the writing anxiety that you're having, the neutral stance that you might be putting forth in your writing, which can sometimes manifest as like passive voice, excessive quotations, like accidental plagiarism a lot of times comes up because maybe you don't feel confident paraphrasing. And so all of these things that I shared with you are ways that you can strengthen that identity, strengthen that voice. And it really is about committing to your ideas, critically reading, thinking about what is your argument, taking that top-down approach, and then learning the nuances of academic writing so that you can make intentional decisions about the words that you're using and you're putting forth to your audience. So we covered a lot. We covered basically every aspect, high level, of the lit review process except revision and editing. All of these could be its own webinar. There's a lot of information that I packed in here today, but I'm hoping that this high level overview helped you kind of wrap your head around what you're up against. Maybe you're in the middle of it. Maybe you're currently revising and you don't know how to go about revising, or maybe you're just getting started. But I know that we're a little over time, so I'm just going to go ahead and stop. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm just going to look in the chat and see if there's anything specific, any specific questions that I need to address. And you're welcome to stay as I answer these questions. But I will be sending out this recording and the presentation later. So I can just see if there's any good questions that I could answer live. Yeah, there's a question about anthropology. So I'm definitely not in the humanities. A lot of my perspective is like social sciences, even hard sciences. So there are definitely differences to how individuals in the humanities approach the lit review and the writing process. So I think that's important to point out. To put my glasses on. Oh, just a lot of thank you. I don't see any. If I'm missing a question, please feel to drop it back in. Drop in a new question, but I don't see anything. Any thoughts on when there isn't a lot of literature because the topic is a bit newer? Oh, this is a good one. So yes, I think about, I'll just use an example. Whenever I finished my master's degree, my first job as a research director was with this really big interprofessional education grant. And we were trying to bring together disciplines that had never worked together in a medical environment before. And I had that same issue. Like, I couldn't find any literature on how these disciplines could work together in a clinical setting. And so my challenge then was like, how am I going to wrap my head around this? Like, I need to understand and look at the literature to be able to put forth some sort of hypothesis or theory about how this might work, what the challenges are going to be. And so ultimately, I had to look for other different topics, but similar context. So I was specifically focusing on bringing together nurse practitioners and dentists within one setting. And there wasn't literature on that at the time. So I looked to the behavioral health field and looked at literature on how in the behavioral health field they had attempted to bring together medicine, primary care, and behavioral health specialist. And so that literature helped me wrap my head around some of the challenges and limitations and successes that we might encounter in our attempt. So sometimes you have to look outside of your specific topic, but maybe the core phenomenon is similar enough that it can help you understand how to approach the topic. Yeah. Good. I'm glad that helped, Diane. Wonderful. Well, I appreciate all of you being here today. Again, you will receive the presentation and the recording. I'll send some links to resources, and we're always available to support you in any way. Dissertation by Design has a pretty large YouTube channel. We have a lot of material there that's free. Take advantage of it. And we're always available if any of you need support. So I appreciate you spending your lunch hour with me today. Take care.